Hey everyone, today let's look at DBD's least played killers and consider why no one plays them. We're going to be looking at the killers that have a less than 1% pick rate. Let's get into it. The Hag. Hag is a fairly easy character to diagnose, as she's one of the most outdated characters on the DBD roster, being released in 2016 and receiving debatably just 2 major updates or buffs since her launch. That's like a big change every 5 years. It's no surprise therefore that Hag is not looked at particularly favourably. This is only compounded when considering that Hag has been getting weaker over the years too, where once she was actually quite formidable and you'd find her frequently in the A tier on a typical tier list, where nowadays she's found somewhere close to the bottom. So what exactly happened? Well, in some ways what happened is that nothing happened. The lack of changes to Hag and the general lack of attention she's had has resulted in her persistently falling down the tier list to the point where she's one of the weakest killers in the game in some instances. Yet she seems to have no significant rework or buff in sight. The reason for her being weak is one not too dissimilar to Trapper, the other major trap character. She takes a long time to set up, and even when she gets going there's a sizable chance the survivor side is able to dismantle all your progress. The big kicker for Hag, and one of the changes that essentially killed her, was the change she got in patch 6.7.0, where trap wiping was added, allowing survivors to wipe away her traps, leaving her often quite useless, with her also being countered by survivors crouching. It doesn't sound like much, but these two things are quite significant, especially against a coordinated team. But why does this mean she gets a low pick rate when Trapper doesn't, despite him having the same issues? Well, I think the main thing is just that Trapper's traps actually guarantee damage or a benefit of some kind. If a survivor steps into a trap, they're injured and held in place, whereas for Hag, you have to be in range, teleport to them, and still land the hit. Even if they get disarmed, you still hear the snap for Trapper and see exactly where they are. Trapper is also the introductory character to the game, and therefore he's sort of meant to be fairly weak. Trapper is also considerably easier to set up and remain set up, with you generally getting value by placing traps in high traffic areas, and traps being easy to reset. Hag is not really the same, and her traps are far more temperamental, and can be dismantled very quickly. The big issue with Hag is something to do with how the pace of the game has exceeded her, and her power is no longer able to assist her enough to counter it. Hag just isn't fast enough for current DBD, in both setup, but also even when her traps are triggered, she often just can't pressure well enough, with her setup area being dismantled in seconds sometimes. Nor can she successfully camp like she used to be able to, as there's a billion anti-camp measures now. Therefore she's kind of useless in a lot of situations. This leaves Hag in a very weak spot, as she's just not good at much anymore, as she relies largely on survivor mistakes more than good plays, an altruistic team throwing themselves repeatedly toward a single corner of the map, for example. This isn't a usual occurrence though. I could see Hag being fixed with, honestly, a pretty substantial rework, something that I don't think is that drastic considering she's one of the oldest characters in the game, and she's not been significantly changed from her initial version since way back in 2016. Almost everything about her and her map could use a refresh. The Twins. Twins seem like no mystery anymore, with them not having a good pick rate since, well, their release. Their issues have been gone over thoroughly throughout the years, and so I don't want to reiterate too much of what their issues are. The core ones, however, are that they're 1. An acquired taste with their unique ability, 2. They have a bad reputation from their early days, 3. They're visually disinteresting and often perceived as boring, 4. They've received so few changes it feels somewhat pointless to engage with the character, 5. Their playstyles aside slugging are not encouraged enough. They're the main ones, I think, at least. Twins are a case of a character who are actually quite strong. Twins are often placed solidly in the A tier, but for many this just doesn't quite cut it. They still don't want to play them. They may be strong, but that doesn't mean people want to play them, especially when sized up against more typically accessible and fast-paced powers that belong to dash killers. Twins do have this in a way with Victor's movement, but it's an acquired taste for sure. The mental load of controlling 2 characters at once is often just not that appealing to most people, which I think is also why they're often played as sluggers, as it's the easiest way to play them and requires the least amount of thought, to simply release Victor and let him pop off basically. I think a simple thing that could help Twins is an add-on rework. A rework to their add-ons that encourages different playstyles. I also think some kind of system where using the 2 twins in conjunction is rewarded, a benefit of some kind where performance with one leads to a buff for the other, encouraging you to switch between the 2 killers more often, and play tactically with both of them in mind, rather than just leaving Charlotte to hook and Victor to chase. I also think Charlotte could use something that makes her stand out more, as currently she's just sort of a regular killer, and Victor is the power. It'd be a lot cooler I think if she was kind of the power too, too, and offered her own unique abilities or stats that forced you as the player to use them in conjunction more thoughtfully. I think that would be fun. The Skull Merchant. Skull Merchant is the most problematic character of the game's 10-year lifespan, easily, and so it's no surprise her pick rate is low, with her being genuinely hated by a majority of the player base since her launch. This is the main issue with Merchant too, is that her reputation is likely never going to recover from the damage that was done to it around her launch. Merchant is held responsible not only for herself as a character and her power, but also for the entirety of the 3-gen or gen kick meta, a meta which wasn't really her fault either, but she became sort of the figurehead for it as she was an easy target. Despite the days of her actually being able to hold a game hostage for a full hour being far gone, this is what people still remember of her and think of her 3 years and 3 reworks later, and countless alterations too. It's a hate that has reached the point of a community joke, where Skull Merchant bad is not too dissimilar from Demo being a dog, or Pig having a boopable snoot, or Nia being the entity. In many ways it's sad because Merchant is considerably better now, and her gameplay is honestly fine. I don't love it personally, but she certainly doesn't still deserve the hate she gets, or people who DC against her. Unfortunately, I also think she's in the position where she is maybe unfixable, in the sense that people will never accept her, even if she was given like a dash power or something. Her reputation has ballooned beyond reason, basically. The approach to her currently seems to be to just kind of ignore her, which isn't necessarily the worst approach, I'd say. Inevitably though, the more she's ignored by developers, the more she's ignored by players too, which only compounds on the ones already ignoring her, leaving her in a funny spot. I don't necessarily think there's a fix for Merchant, aside consistently improving her and her reputation, which is going to take genuinely years, but I think it can be done eventually. It's definitely improved a little bit over the past few years. The Cenobite. Now, I don't want to go too deep into why Pinhead has a low pick rate, as there's a fairly obvious reason why he's not played much, with him getting removed from the store, and therefore not being buyable anymore. This will inevitably kill a character's play rate, as less new players have access to get them in the first place. However, Pinhead's low pick rates didn't start with his removal from the game in April 2025. He's always had a fairly low pick rate. His power has often been revered as one of the harder ones in the game, with him having a main ability that is very hard to aim and get value from. Even when you do land a chain shot, it doesn't guarantee damage or a benefit necessarily, unless you're able to act on it somehow. This is fairly similar to Hag and how her traps don't guarantee anything. Pinhead acts in the same way. Pinhead and Nurse are often compared with their abilities being similar, where Pinhead directs his chain shot, Nurse's blink indicator is pretty much the same, only she goes to the position of her blink and can damage. Pinhead remains in place and can only hold a survivor in place briefly. It's simply a weaker ability and also feels far more punishing and difficult to get value from. You can land a great shot, but it doesn't necessarily mean you get the hit. For many, this is unsatisfying. Pinhead is only complicated further when looking at the box, an entirely unique mechanic to only him, and one which performs rather confusingly. In order to play Pinhead decently well, you need to understand the box spawn logic, and know where and when to look for it, in order to extend or begin chain hunts. There's nothing in the game that relays this really either. Your best bet is going on YouTube or somewhere like that and finding a tutorial. The game presents it as luck essentially. Find the box before the survivors do, or you don't get the box. The kicker being that survivors can see the box the whole time as well, making it a very unreliable strategy. So I think Pinhead isn't played much because, well, he's not purchasable in the store anymore, he's passive in his power, and simply his power is confusing and not explained enough to new players. So as unique and cool as Pinhead is, many will opt for dozens of other options. Pinhead also suffers from having barely any cosmetics, which does definitely affect pick rate too, I think. To get Pinhead played more, I don't think it's possible anymore due to him no longer being purchasable, but I do think to encourage the people who do already own him to play him more, just a more detailed tutorial or breakdown of his power would be helpful, along with some tweaks to his power to possibly make his chain shots more rewarding. The Krasue. Krasue is another fascinating case, being less than a year old, yet with her pick rate being one of the lowest, even though upon her release she was one of the strongest characters in the game, and even debated to be the strongest at one point. Then she got nerfed. The thing is, she's still very strong, yet no one plays her regardless. So what exactly is happening there? Why does no one play a fairly objectively strong killer? I think the core and main reason is honestly just that she's not very fun, which maybe sounds like quite a subjective reason, but I think it shows through the pick rate and does in general connect many characters on this list. Her gameplay is just not that satisfying, and the main issue I think is that she feels clunky. Despite her having a strong movement ability, a solid lunge attack, and even a third-person perspective, she just doesn't feel good to play. There's something weirdly stiff about her and her movement, mostly notable in her Krasue form or the head form. Turning can feel stiff, lunging feels restrictive and too locked, and she has lots of small cooldowns or transitional phases that slow your movement, making her simply feel bad to play. The other even more simplistic reason I think is that people find her confusing and just a bit overloaded with things. Her power is weirdly confusing, and I remember even back on the PTB, she was the only killer ever on a PTB where I've gone in completely blind on what the new power is, and I couldn't figure it out just by using it. Every other time, I've been able to figure it out. This is mainly pertaining to the leeching mechanic, the way you have to first apply the leech, then switch to your head form to do damage and repeat. It feels so clunky and slightly convoluted, and the switching between the two forms messes up gameplay flow entirely, as they don't feel like they naturally feed into one another. Often you just leech a survivor and then switch immediately, making the leech in the first place feel kind of pointless as a mechanic, with the extra step of cleansing it through the fungus being just another complication. Her power feels cluttered and clunky, and this maybe wouldn't be a problem if she was competing with other characters who were also cluttered and clunky. However, she's largely competing with maybe the most popular character type in the game, dash characters, or high mobility characters like Wesker, Blight, and even Nurse to some extent. Much like these characters, she is really strong, but those characters are strong, but also really simple at a base level. Nurse you can blink, Blight you just rush at the push of a button, and even Wesker is a dash, with his infection applying when he lands a hit. It's passive. Each character has one core thing to think about, and also feel very smooth to play. So the question simply is, why would you ever pick Krasue, a character who isn't as smooth, isn't as snappy, isn't quite as strong compared to many of them, and is plagued with a number of transitional cooldowns and slowing periods? The answer is, there just isn't much of a reason to pick her from the rest. Even if you like the draw of her as a character or her visual design, she doesn't have any offerings really in terms of cosmetics either. So despite being brand new and strong, she simply isn't appealing. She could benefit from her power being simplified, and a focus being put on the smoothness of its feel and movement, as currently that's the biggest issue I think. She's strong, but she's clunky, and honestly quite boring to play. She does have potential to be exciting too, as during her launch she was quite popular, and many loved the gruesomeness of this chapter and Krasue's visual design. The Houndmaster. Houndmaster is another case of a character who is actually very strong, but a bit like Krasue, people just seem to not want to play her still, and it is quite curious why. The obvious reason for her is that much like Skull Merchant, her initial release really set the tone for time to come. Houndmaster was very buggy on her release, and it led to her reception being incredibly poor. This I do think is the main reason why she isn't played very much, in part because her bugs are still very much present, but also because people got a bad taste early on, so much so that they haven't bothered to revisit the character, which is a shame too, as Houndmaster is realistically a character that most people should like, in theory. She's essentially a dash character, only she commands that dash rather than uses it herself, with Snug basically being a dash character, not too dissimilar from Wesker, with Snug getting an initial dash and then one to redirect position. It's actually a fairly similar case to some of the other characters we've discussed today, like Pinhead, with him firing his chain shot rather than directly going to the location like Nurse, or like Hag who has to teleport over herself after her trap is triggered, rather than the trap just inflicting damage. Houndmaster is another case of a killer who is quite passive, I suppose, in that way, and her ability acts as more as a means to get her closer to the survivor, rather than directly injuring the survivor or applying damage directly. This extra step, I think, is just not very appealing to a lot of people, who would prefer a more instantly gratifying character who gets them damage when they do something skillful, and not a few seconds afterwards. Houndmaster also suffers like many of the others here, as she just doesn't get much attention from the developers. In terms of cosmetics, she's had very few, and in terms of actual patches or updates, she's had not much at all since her initial release. To be honest though, it's largely because she's actually pretty balanced where she is. It's sort of an artist situation, where because she's very balanced, it means she gets barely any changes, but then people don't really want to play her because nothing ever changes about the character. It is still relatively early days with Houndmaster though in comparison, and I think with time this will change. The main and core reason for her lack of play though, I think is simply the bugs still, and further and more specifically, her reputation for having bugs, which is naturally off-putting when it comes to picking up the character. To fix Houndmaster, I think, similar to Skull Merchant, it is tough, as her core issue is her reputation and her association with being buggy, and also just how quiet her launch was due to the complete lack of marketing. Equally, this is still currently kinda quite true, so a start would be eliminating all of her bugs once and for all, because aside the bugs, she should in theory, again, be a popular character, with her power being fast-paced and actually quite strong as well. You also get a dog, what's not to love? In terms of driving new players toward her, I reckon something as simple as a few buffs or tweaks to her kit could lead people to check her out. The Demogorgon. Demo is perhaps the most shocking pick to see so low as a character that is actually really well loved by the community. It doesn't make much sense why people wouldn't play it at face value. It's also not a case like Pinhead anymore, as Demo is purchasable in the store, where once before it wasn't. Demo is simple, easily accessible to a new audience of players, and is from a popular franchise, Stranger Things. So what exactly is the problem with Demo? Well, the only thing I can really see when it comes to Demo is just that it's a pretty weak character, often being in the bottom 5 of many people's tier lists. It's just in that position where lots of people simply don't want to play it because it's not good. I want to suggest another issue with Demo though as well, and that's that Demo is maybe a bit too simple for its own good. Whilst a benefit when first learning the game, it quickly becomes clear that Demo is just not that deep basically. I could see why a player who wants to pick a main and learn everything about them wouldn't choose Demo, because it's just really basic. The shred attack is essentially just an extended lunge, and whilst there are some definite angles and tiles to learn how to leap around, it doesn't have the same skill expression say as a hug tech with Wesker, or the precision you can get from Blight's rushes. It's a fixed angle forward dash, which simply can't be tinkered with that much. Its other ability, its portals, are one of the most basic and straightforward teleports in the game, allowing you to traverse from point A to point B without much complication. Then that's kind of it, especially as Demo's add-ons have always been incredibly dull, to be honest, mostly being number changes or small alterations to its kit. I hate to say it, but Demo is just quite boring by today's standards, where we have killers able to switch forms or have an entire wheel of spells. A dog who can jump far just isn't as appealing, especially when the skill ceiling is low and the potential is also decently low, I'd argue. I think the best thing for Demo is a solid rework to its add-ons for a start, to make them more interesting and dynamic, and then also a rework to its portals specifically, to give them something a bit extra, some more depth of some kind, as often portals are completely ignored when playing Demo. Alright, well, that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed, and let me know your thoughts about why these killers aren't played as well down below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.